With that down, let's move on to our fifth and final main topic today. And our fifth and final main topic today gets sent in to us by Greg Martin, who writes, is it possible, just possible, is it the worst news in the multiverse could possibly get? It is the worst news. Sorry, I'm looking at two different scripts here that have different words. It is the worst news the multiverse could possibly get. Scott Derrickson has just let people know that he is no longer directing Doctor Strange 2 over the dreaded creative differences. I'm gutted. I love that first film so much, and a lot of it was his style and art. How do you feel about him leaving the movie? All right, thanks a lot for writing that in, Greg. And to Greg's point, what he is talking about is that, yeah, Scott Derrickson, who did such an incredible job with that first Doctor Strange movie, a movie that probably 7 or 8 years ago you'd say, well, you can't do a Doctor Strange movie. I mean, that's not going to work. And they did. And it was great. And it was fun. And all that sort of stuff. So he was coming back to direct the second. Everybody got excited when they announced that he was coming back to direct the second one. And then they dropped it yesterday, Rob. Scott got on his social media and wrote, Marvel and I have mutually agreed to part ways on Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness due, and there it is, to creative differences. I am thankful for our collaboration and will remain on as executive producer, which is, of course, doesn't actually mean he's going to do anything moving forward. It's just that he's going to get this credit for all the work that he's already done in it. Rob, I got to ask you first, because I know you were a big fan of that first Doctor Strange movie.
Oh, I was.
How are you feeling about the news that that he's stepping down and he's out of the picture at this point over creative differences?
Well, you look, it's always unfortunate when this happens, and it's not easy for anyone, especially for someone who's already made a successful film for the studio within the MCU. Doctor Strange is a beloved film. Benedict Cumberbatch was a great addition, and as we saw in Infinity War and Endgame, a very important addition to the MCU. And I thought that there was a lot of great vision and a lot of creativity in that first movie. So it's unfortunate. Now everyone wants to know why. Like, is there some kind of a scandal? I honestly believe in this case, we've heard that WandaVision might seeg right into Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. I think probably there really was, in this case, actual creative differences where Derrickson probably wanted to go in, lean more heavily into the horror elements of this. I mean, it is called the Multiverse of Madness. It's not called the Multiverse of, well, I'm a little angry, you know. So I think that he probably had big plans, and those plans probably wasn't exactly the kind of direction that, I mean, it's with Disney Plus, these shows debuting on Disney Plus, there's only so far you can push this stuff now. And I think that maybe, and Scott Derrickson came out of the horror realm, and he probably wanted to do things that might not have been acceptable, at least acceptable in terms of the plans, the overarching plans of Kevin Feige and the MCU. So rather than be banging his head against a wall, he probably came to the realization that, you know, it's time for me to move on.
I first of all, I'm really disappointed by this news. I'm really disappointed by it, because I thought when they first announced that he was going to be the director of the first Doctor Strange, I loved it, because you look at his previous films to come into something like Doctor Strange, I thought he was a great fit for it. And I was really stoked about what he could bring to the table for that. But there's another reason that makes me kind of fascinated by this news. And that's this. Whenever we hear, one of the big things that we as fans like to scream is, we don't want studio interference. We don't want studio interference is one of the things that a lot of us as film fans will constantly be shouting and screaming and everything. But I've always kind of said, guys, like, I don't hear anybody screaming and crying and whining and complaining about all the studio interference that Marvel has over their films. Because if you don't think Kevin Feige isn't pulling the strings on every one of those movies, you're a special kind of naive. I mean, he gives each one of his directors a certain amount of creative freedom to do some things, but he is absolutely injecting and telling them what can and cannot happen. And I'm very curious to see in this situation, Rob, if it got to the point where a director who did such a good job on the first movie is now departing the second one long after they announced him and long after they'd already started, working on the pre-production of the film and everything, that he's splitting out the door over creative differences. I'm going to be very curious to see if people give Marvel a hard time over the studio interference thing. Now, as for me personally, I think a studio should be involved. I mean, it's their movie. They're the ones.
Right.
Like, this is what I always say. You can hire an interior decorator for your house, and you want them to bring their expertise and their vision to your house. But they also got to do it in such a way that it makes the house you want and that you want to live in. So yes, you give them freedom, but they have to follow your direction because it's your house. I kind of always seen that the same way that the studios and the filmmakers of their movies. We want to give the filmmakers the freedom to do what they want to do, but at the same time, it's our house, it's our film. We're the ones paying for it. We're the ones who are going to lose money on this. We're the ones who are this, blah, blah, blah. So I always believe there should be a little bit of interference. There should be a little bit of involvement from the studio to a degree. But I am very curious, Rob, to see if people are going to make this a big deal and say, the studio's interfering, or... And this could be a fair thing to say, or does studio interference, is that a concept that doesn't apply to Marvel because of the special and kind of unique setup and circumstances that Marvel is right now? I'm so curious about it, Rob, that I decided to make that the topic of today's question of the day, everybody. And the question of the day, I put this up just before the show started on my Twitter. I put up a poll asking you guys this simple question. The question of the day, with Scott Derrickson leaving Doctor Strange 2 over creative differences, is this a case of studio interference in a filmmaker's vision, or, and to be fair, does that not necessarily apply to Marvel because Marvel's such a unique situation? That's what I asked you guys. Put it up just before the show. Almost 2,000 of you guys have voted already. And right now, I'm surprised to see about 71.8% of you are saying, no, you interpret this as studio interference, I'm surprised by this. I really thought that number would be lower. And 28.2% of you guys right now are saying you think because of the uniqueness of the situation with Marvel, that's not really a principle that applies here. So that's how it's breaking down right now. 71.8 are saying it is studio interference. 28.2 are saying it doesn't really apply. So that leaves the question for you guys. Do you guys think that this is studio interference, or do you think that it's not really applicable? And actually, Rob, let me put that question to you as well. How do you see it? Do you think this is something people could fairly criticize as studio interference? Or do you think because of the extremely unique nature of Marvel that studio interference really isn't a principle that comes into play?
I think you're right about that. I don't think you could call it studio interference because the studio has... Look, we've got 23 movies to see what they wanted to do. Now, I think there's probably a new pressure that never existed before, which is, where do we go from here? Like the song from Once More with Feeling and Buffy. Where do you go from here? Now that you've made all the money in the world, now that your films are incredibly successful, you're moving into a new realm. You're on Disney Plus. You've got to make that work now with the movies that have to then work back with the Disney Plus shows. So there's a new set of circumstances, and all of the movies moving forward, they're all going to be expected to make $1 billion now, whether that's rightfully or wrongfully, but that's what they're expecting. So I think there's creative pressures and there's financial pressures now that are a direct result of the success of Marvel, and they don't want to mess with that. And so those extra added pressures are going to hamstring any kind of, I think, real out-of-the-box creativity that, of course, a filmmaker wants to bring. You don't want to repeat yourself. You don't want to play it safe. I mean, they already titled the movie Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. That's pretty insane to me. And I'm like, okay, if you're gonna call your movie that, I expect to see a multiverse of madness, especially after the end of Doctor Strange with the scene with Dormammu, which I thought was it was a lot of fun and ballsy and a great way to end the movie. You got to go a lot more mad than that. That's what you're saying you're going to do. So I think that there's probably, inevitably, I don't think this is, by the way, going to be the first time this happens. You know, I think everybody wants to do these movies, but I think success, John, breeds a lot of craziness and an extra added layer that you have to deal with. That's just the nature of the beast. So we'll see where it goes. It's not unexpected to me, though.
And of course, this isn't the first time this has happened in the MCU as well. Most notably, of course, was the whole Edgar Wright departure. That was a very unique situation because it was like 5 or 6 years between when they announced it was going to do it and then they were actually executing it. And apparently Edgar is still on great terms with Marvel and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like it's the first time. Question is, guys, how are you feeling about Scott Derrickson departing, the upcoming Doctor Strange sequel? Are you kind of bummed out about it like some of us are? Do you maybe see it as not a big deal? Do you see it as studio interference? Do you not? How are you feeling about it in general? Jump down to the comment section below and let us know your thoughts.